History is written by the victors, and Gwyn has lied to us all. Dark Souls story is told from the narrative of Gwyn's lies. The perspective is written to us on the virtue of his influence on the world. The story of Dark Souls, contradictory to its name, is the story of Gwyn. But what happens when we correct this storyline? What happens when we use all the context clues, pieces of lore, dialogue and item descriptions from the trilogy from beginning to end to rebuild history as told from the perspective of the victims, unaltered by a tyrant who clung to power? This is the story of the search for the Dark Soul. At the beginning of the world, we are told of two notable events, one of which we are completely familiar with. The other is brushed so far under the rug, we are given nothing but a single line of dialogue. The story we are all familiar with is that Gwyn and his company found the Fiery Lord Souls. Gwyn found the most prominent soul and took charge of the Lords to countless victories. We are also, however, told of a being known as the Furtive Pygmy. He found a very different soul, distinctly unlike that of the Lords. The Furtive Pygmy, although different to Gwyn, had shared a vision of a world after the stagnant age of ancients. Gwyn recognised the Furtive Pygmy's equal strength and in good faith would recruit the Furtive Pygmy and notably to his kin, the Pygmy Warriors. We are never told about the existence of the Pygmy Warriors until the crescendo of the trilogy, and there is good reason why, as the narrator seems to perpetuate Gwyn's erasionist telling of the world and can be assumed to be under Gwyn's worldview. Through influence or allegiance, we will never know, but it doesn't matter. Because in this main narrative, the Furtive Pygmy's role in the war against the Ancients is never spoken of. We learn from later installments of the game that the Furtive Pygmy, and specifically his knights, were integral in helping slay the Archdragons, in such great efficiency that Gwyn himself lauded some of the so-called Pygmy warriors. After the Archdragons are brought down, Gwyn would begin to carve a new world. This new world, however, put the flame inherent to the Lord Souls at the top of the food chain. In this, Gwyn had already betrayed the Furtive Pygmy in creating a shared world of a fair world for both the Lords and the Pygmies. During this period, it's likely the Furtive Pygmy becomes distasteful of Gwyn, and this distaste would scare Gwyn to the core, afraid of the Pygmies as their strength was proven to be monumental during the Age of Ancients. Unable to physically undermine the Pygmies, Gwyn would trick the Pygmy warriors by enticing them into roles of authority under the pretense they accept the then elusive Dark Sign. This Dark Sign, however, served one single purpose: to seal the darkness, aka the source of their humanity, in a circle of fire, forever bound to the fate of the Lord's fiery souls, and therefore the will of Gwyn and the preservation of his new age. Eventually, the Pygmies have descendants, shackled too by Gwyn's circle of flame. These descendants are known as humans. Under the influence of Gwyn, the Pygmies blur the nature of humans' true purpose on Earth, and these people become devout followers of Gwyn, while their humanity, deep in the confines of the Dark Sign, mysteriously yearn for a new world. The Pygmies are eventually granted a city so deep and hidden that only a few know of its existence and even few know of its location. Some Pygmies become lords of this land while others become guards who are visible branding of Gwyn's Dark Sign. During this time, a certain primordial serpent is coming into his own. A descendant of the now vanquished Archdragons, Carth did not exist in the same framework as the Lords and the Pygmies and had no allegiance to either. However, either from a lust for power or a passion for justice, Carth learns of Gwyn's actions and comes to the Furtive Pygmy to teach him of Gwyn's misdeeds. Gwyn's betrayal, and most specifically the curse Gwyn has tricked his beloved children into accepting. The furtive pygmy, infuriated at this discovery, takes on the form of a being known as Manus, the father of the abyss. Manus slowly begins enlightening his true children to their purpose in this world and their humanity at the core of their being. Manus's fury begins projecting through the humans who are close to him, causing them to take on similar forms, abandoning their blind allegiance to Gwyn. Taking on new appearances, these humans begin pushing back against their internal shackles built by Gwyn, and even learn of the art of dark sorcery, projections of their own humanity. Ulasil, the town under the influence of Manus, begins changing, and eventually Gwyn learns of this change and sends some of his greatest knights, such as Artorius, to slay Manus. But of course, Artorius is human, and so is too susceptible to Manus's influence. Artorius begins taking on a new darker form, one truer to his birthright, and eventually is confused by his allegiance to Gwyn and his humanity within, and eventually abandons his mission and rests confused at the entrance of Ulasil, conveniently acting as a guard to the township and Manus's lair. Unfortunately, during this time, Gwyn's influence is at its height, and eventually another human knight, influenced by stories of Gwyn's later prophecies, is brought to Manus and finally slays the furtive pygmy, shattering his soul into tiny little fragments that become echoes in history. But at this point, our friend Karth is not done fighting for us and carries on Manus's mission of enlightenment in pursuit of teaching others the nature of man. In his campaign, Karth has one very notable success. This success came in the way of the Four Kings of New Londo. The Four Kings were humans granted a portion of Gwyn's soul due to their strength and ability to govern. However, they would begin to rage against Gwyn once Karth was able to teach them Gwyn's true nature and also the art of life drain, granting them the ability to capture other humans' humanity. With this new strength, the Four Kings would create a covenant of men to fight against Gwyn, known as the Dark Race, missionaries of justice in the face of tyranny who possess the knowledge of his injustice and the power to challenge it head-on. However, Gwyn's panopticon is all-seeing, and eventually he learns of the Four Kings' rebellious tendencies, and in one of the worst atrocities in the entire trilogy, Gwyn drowns the entirety of New Londo, killing millions and sealing away the Four Kings in the rubble. However, some of the Dark Wraiths persevered and devoted themselves to Karth's original mission. These survivors would later create a new covenant and assemble a group known as the Pilgrims. We learn more about the Pilgrims later, as during this time, Gwyn's flame is beginning to dwindle and the fate of the Age of Fire was materializing a world where the Pilgrims could take charge of the order of the world and galvanize humans to a fairer world. Success for the downtrodden was near. However, Gwyn's cowardice shines again, and in fear and desperation he burns himself to reignite the flames of the Age of Fire. But doing so, he also curses all humans with the Hollowing, a side product of the perversion of nature and the dark sign he inflicted on them. Gwyn has proven again to be a tyrant battling nature's course. In order to make the Age of Fire even more sustainable, Gwyn this time embarks on his own propaganda campaign, creating a prophecy that would encourage humans to gain strength and sacrifice themselves to keep the flame lit. This ends up being one of Gwyn's most prominent successes, and many humans would take heed of Gwyn's prophecy and burn their souls to keep the flame lit, despite acting in a way that perpetuates the very force that encapsulates their humanity. Nature is not so easily bested though, as eventually the unnatural persistence of the Age of Fire begins to take a toll on the world itself and begins turning parts of the world into ash. However, during this time the pilgrims have been roaming the earth, attempting to materialise a rebellion against Gwyn and his new cycle, and eventually they create a home known as Londor, likely named after the birthplace of their movement, the home of the Four Kings. Londor was fair to the Hollows. It empowered their new undead form and celebrated the so-called curse as something of a projection of their humanity fighting against their internal shackles. Londor would become perfect ground for Hollows to learn and develop, and eventually a few notable Hollows would take the knowledge of Karth and his revolutionary ideals and venture into the now ash-ridden land of the Lords to bring about a new age, the Age of Londor, expanding their fairness to the greater world and all Hollows who have been tricked to suffer under Gwyn's cycle. They sought to turn the will of Londor into a new order for the world. An order that put the previously oppressed Hollows at the top of the food chain. But first, they needed a warrior champion. In time, the notable pilgrims such as Yuria would find their champion in the form of a certain chosen undead. This certain chosen undead would find the remnants of Manus in the form of the Dark Sigils and take the power of the furtive pygmy to slay the lords, the last vestments of Gwyn, and usurp the first flame, bringing the order of Londor to the greater world. But this is not the Age of the Dark that the humans were destined. For that, we have to find the entirety of the Dark Soul. The Dark Sigils were only the souls of Manus, not the furtive pygmy from the beginning of the game. The soul of the furtive pygmy was split amongst his kin, the Pygmy Lords. If we want to truly materialise a new world, the world where we were destined to have one before Gwyn's meddling, we have to find every remnant of the Pygmies. For that, we have to find a way to the Ringed City, the home of the remaining Pygmy Lords, and therefore the final piece to the puzzle in the search for the Dark Soul. If you remember, only a few had access to the Ringed City, and through some luck the chosen undead meets a peculiar man named Gale. Gale is not an agent of the Dark, but a lonely knight who has fought and died in the front line of war for years and years, and now wants to save a different world. The world of Ariandel, a parallel plane to our own. Drawn to justice, the chosen undead helps Gale free his alternative realm and meets a painter. The painter is a young girl on a mission of her own, one that is even more grand than Karth, Manus or the Pilgrims. She tells the chosen undead of her ambition to create a new world together, somewhere that is not plagued by conflict, somewhere that can be home for all, a quiet place where we can all coexist. Unfortunately, the painter is low on paint and requires more. But not just any ordinary paint, she requires something that is of the utmost worthy pigment. Perhaps the pigment of a class of beings that have only ever known despair, oppression, and suffering. She requires the Dark Soul, the combined humanity of all men, because if not this, then who? Humans in this world have only ever been puppets to a regime that feared their birthright and controlled them to this very moment in history. This oppression is seen in none better than Gale, a man who has fought his entire life meaninglessly being shoved into the front line to combat those he has little understanding of. It's therefore not surprising that Gale eventually comes to the chosen undead with a task. He has found the Ringed City, the last remaining land of the old lords, and the place that holds the final vestments of the furtive pygmy. With Gale's help, the chosen undead enters the Ringed City and finds the ancient remnants of the Pygmies, the Pygmy warriors, and finally the Pygmy lords. Gale, having already decimated his way through the Ringed City, finds us at the end of the world. He has consumed every Pygmy in this land and hosts their souls in him. Gale has captured every aspect of the furtive Pygmy that isn't the ones hosted by the chosen undead, and at the end of the world, two beings hosting the strongest aspects of the Dark Soul engage in in a final battle, and eventually Gale is defeated, handing over his aspect of the Dark Soul, bringing us, the manifestation of the furtive pygmy, finally into one piece. As the Dark Soul sits within our possession, we can ask ourselves, is the search for the Dark Soul over with its physical manifestation, or did we find it much before this, as in truth, Gale represented everything the Dark Soul was. The Dark Soul has always been so much more than a physical object. It was a plight of a man who has been thrown to fodder his entire life, driven by a passion and a deep yearning for a world that cared. With this, the chosen undead returns to the painter, Dark Soul in tow. She begins painting a world where the Dark Soul is finally at the helm, a world where the humans are no longer burdened by the actions of a tyrannical lord. In these final moments, the Dark Soul is not just found, but given a home. Gale is given a home.